Hey guys, 3 questions today. The first one is very interesting because it's going to prompt me to talk about a hypothesis I have about World War II, which, I don't know, I'm going to tell you, let me know what you think about the hypothesis. Yes, no, maybe you don't know, let me know. So, let's get on with the first question. Craig has asked, I read in a book that the Polish campaign was the only true Blitzkrieg campaign. An attack designed to paralyze an enemy at the start by attacks against command control and communications, transportation links, troop concentration areas, etc. And the attacks against France and Russia were merely the German standard method of attack, encircling the enemy's armies in order to destroy them using modern arms, tanks, motorized infantry, aircraft, etc. What is your view on this? It's interesting because I've actually heard it's the other way round. I've heard that the Polish campaign wasn't the true Blitzkrieg and that France and then the Soviet Union were the true Blitzkriegs. And that's in itself stupid because the word Blitzkrieg, the term, was invented to describe the Polish campaign by the Western Allies, or the West in general. So it's like none of this makes any sense. And I think the confusion here lies in the fact that Blitzkrieg itself is a made-up term. It doesn't exist. I've explained this before. The actual term that the Germans use is Bewegungskrieg, which means war of movement. And if you take that, war of movement, and then look at the Polish campaign, yeah, it's a war of movement. It's not a Stellungskrieg. It's not a, I'm going to sit there firing artillery shells at you and, you know, trench warfare. It's not that. It's a maneuver war. And so is France, and so is the Soviet Union, at least in 1941. So if you had the term Bewegungskrieg, then all three make sense. If you have the term Blitzkrieg, because it doesn't. Blitzkrieg, the made-up term, means lightning war. Well, if that's the case, then, yeah, okay, Poland and France are lightning wars, but the Soviet Union certainly wasn't. It lasted 4 years, so that's not a lightning war. But if you say it to me what you explain, which I think I've seen in documentaries, where we're going to encircle and... No, sorry, we're not going to do that. We're going to break through the enemy's lines. We're going to hit the rear areas. We're going to bypass areas of resistance and so on and so forth. That sort of thing. That's just... I mean, if you look at France, the Battle of Sedan, they did the same thing. If you look at the Soviet Union, the first few days of the war, that's exactly what they did. They did that. Once they broke through, then they did the whole maneuver and encircling. And they did that in Poland anyway. If I was to explain the Polish campaign in a nutshell, it's basically like a big giant mouth eating the Polish. They have, I think, 2 encirclements. They got a mini encirclement and a mini envelopment, and then a larger envelopment to go right round Warsaw. And so you've got basically 2 mouths, like an alien attack. You've got 2 mouths with these pincers coming in from both sides, trying to chomp down on Poland. And so that was encirclements. There was loads of encirclements in Poland. There was quite a few. It wasn't one giant one like you had with the France and the sickle cuts. It's not like that, but there is multiple encirclements going on. And in the Soviet Union, the same thing applies. There's loads of multiple encirclements going on. So, yeah, I think the issue with this is the term Blitzkrieg. It's like it doesn't mean anything because it's a meaningless term, and it was invented to describe the lightning war in Poland, which you could apply to France, but then not to the Soviet Union. But then others have said France and the Soviet Union were applicable, but Poland wasn't. It's just pointless. I think let's just not use that term. Let's use Bewegungskrieg. War of movement. Poland definitely was a war of movement. France was. Soviet Union was initially. And that makes more sense because the Germans were... The whole point of the German thing is to encircle, Kesselschlacht, cauldron battles. You know, will create pockets and destroy them after the supplies, etc. get used up. That's the whole point. So my view on it is that all 3 were the Bewegungskrieg campaigns and Blitzkrieg is a made-up term. But, and this is where the traditional narrative doesn't make any sense. So let's just say for a second, okay, it's a Blitzkrieg, or it's a Bewegungskrieg war. And the traditional narrative says, well, they went into this Blitzkrieg war, they won in Poland, they won in France, they won in the Balkans, then they went east, and then they lost because the Blitzkrieg broke down, and then this lightning war that they were meant to have fought became a long war, which they weren't prepared for, and as a result, they were overwhelmed, and that's why they lost the war. If only they'd won the Blitzkrieg, right? If only the Blitzkrieg hadn't failed in the Soviet Union for various reasons, like the weather, they would have won, right? That's the traditional narrative. And the reason Germany lost was because they got stuck on a two-front war of attrition and whatever else. But is that really the case? Okay, if there's going to be a war tomorrow, right, what would you do? Would you prepare for a short war, or would you prepare for a long war? And if you prepare for a short war, how do you know that the war is going to be short? Especially when you've just fought, like 20 years before, a very long, bloody war called the First World War, where millions of people died, and, you know, especially on the Western Front, nothing really happened. And that's going to offend some people. But, like, you know, effectively, it was a Stellungskrieg, and you had no movements until the last days of the war. So it's like, wait a second. All the evidence you have suggests that maybe the Second World War would be like the First World War. Yeah, okay, you've moved on a little bit with the tanks. The tanks are slightly better, but essentially, the people going to war in the Second World War are armed just like the First World War. If you look at the British Army, apart from like the Bren gun and the Piat, everybody, you know, they were pretty much armed the same as they were in the First World War. They had the same rifles, more or less. They had, you know, the same weaponry. The same with the Germans. The Germans are using the same weapons. Again, more or less, there's some variants, but you get the idea. So wait a second. How did they know there was going to be a short war? Did they know there was going to be this war's going to be a short war? Really? How did they know that? They didn't. And so the question is, were they looking forward to a short war? And the answer is probably not. In my opinion, my hypothesis is that actually they weren't preparing for a short war. They were in fact preparing for a long war. And we know this is the case because they didn't prioritise the panzer divisions or the motorised divisions. They had some, but not many, and most of the divisions were infantry. They were footborne. They were also reliant on trains. They were also reliant on horses. So that's not really super mobile warfare, not on the offensive. Yeah, on the defensive a train will help, but on the offensive not so much. And horses obviously not so much. And even then, the horses, it's like they only had one cavalry division, which they then later converted into a panzer division. But they had the majority of the German force was infantry. And when you look at what was happening in Germany inside the Third Reich from 1933, they start mobilising from 1933. Secretly at first and later on, obviously, a bit more in the open. But between 1933 and 1935, there's a quote out there which I'll probably put on the screen now if I remember, the amount of money spent was ridiculous. Like it took up like 10% of the GDP. It went from nothing, like less than 1% of GDP, to 10% of GDP in the case of, 2 years or whatever. So Germany's spending massive amounts of money really early on, mobilising their force, converting the economy into a war economy from literally 1933 onwards. Certainly by 1935-36, you have a war economy on the go. Autarky is part of it. We don't want to be trading because we know we're going to war, right? So wait a second, if it's going to be a short war, why stop trading? If it's going to be a quick war, you'll be in and out, you won't need so they've prepared for this war again, which is coming many years down the line, interestingly. But wait a second, they're doing all this, but they want a short war. It doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense. I think what's actually happened here is they were preparing for a long war, And what ended up happening was the war ended up being quicker than they thought, because they had enough oil, technically enough oil for Germany to be self-sufficient, but once they conquered all of Europe, they then didn't have enough oil to supply the whole lot, and therefore there was a drain. Plus, it turned out that panzers and motorised divisions were more important than they thought originally, and it turns out that they need to keep those guys in the field. That cost a lot more oil than they originally assumed, so they had to then get that oil, but obviously that fell in line with what Hitler was doing anyway. But yeah, I think what Germany was doing, and you see this with the High Command, I don't think the High Command weren't like, yes, we want panzer divisions left, right and centre. They weren't like that. They were saying, no, we want infantry divisions. We don't want panzer divisions. At least if you read Guderian, that's what he's saying. And so they didn't want panzer divisions. They didn't want motorised divisions to that extent. They wanted the traditional infantry. They wanted the artillery. And they wanted the tanks to support those units. And it turns out that they ended up fighting a much more Blitzkrieg type war, a shorter type war, and perhaps they weren't prepared for that. So instead of it being the traditional narrative of Germany was aiming for a short war and they ended up getting bogged down in a long war and that's why they lost, I think they were aiming for a long war and that's why they lost the Blitzkrieg. But it's a hypothesis, and it's entirely reliant on the German economy, finding out whether the German economy was prepared for war or not prior to the war, because some people think they didn't prepare for war till 1943, which isn't true. I don't think. It seems that they prepared for war in the early 30s because Hitler was all about autarky and the shrinking markets problem. And then when they got into the war, Speer took over and just made them more efficient. It wasn't like the economy wasn't geared. Oh, the economy wasn't geared to war. No, it was geared to war. It's just two things. Hitler didn't want to stab in the back, which he supposedly happened earlier on, and so he didn't want the full economy being entirely. He didn't want no consumer goods. He wanted some to keep the people happy, so there was no stab in the back. And Speer just made the industries that were geared up more efficient because he was just better than his predecessor. That kind of makes sense. So yeah, that's this is the idea. But if that wasn't the case, if they only geared up in 1943, then yeah, maybe they did just prepare for a short war. But I don't think they did, because how would you know? How can you tell the future, right? How can you tell that there's going to be a short war? You can't do that. It's knowing the future. It's impossible. So I think my hypothesis is the economy was geared up for a longer war. They ended up fighting a shorter war, which they weren't necessarily prepared for, and that's part of the reason why they lost it. And it's also interesting that the traditional analysis says they weren't prepared for the long war, but in actuality they did prepare for the long war, or they prepared for as best as they could, but they still lost it anyway. I don't know. What do you guys think? Let me know about that. So, question 2. Diego has said, "Hi TIK, a question regarding the Third Reich's race against time, i.e. its goal of ending the European war before oil ran out and before the US joined the war. How would an invasion of France, rather than Poland, on the 1st of September 1939 affect this timeline? Could such an early invasion of France even be feasible? Cheers." There are many subtle questions that come to mind in the wake of this possibility as well. Would the German High Command have the confidence to create the case yellow plan without having the test bed that was case white? How would the relationship between the Soviet Union and Germany change if Germany launched only a very limited invasion of Poland to contain the Polish army along the German-Polish border? And how would Britain, the USA, react to such an early invasion of France? Thank you for your unique work. All the best. I don't think it would have happened. The reason why is because of the economic situation. Germany is cut off from the rest of the world, more or less, at this point, and so they need allies. And the only way to get allies was to ally with the Soviet Union. People say they didn't ally. Okay, they didn't ally. They just had a non-aggression pact and a trade deal, and they helped conquer Eastern Europe together, but they weren't allied or anything. Okay. They were allied. The Soviet Union and Germany were allied for 2 years, roughly, and they traded. What did they trade? They traded materials that Germany needed and oil. They needed oil. right? So if you imagine the situation in 1939, if Germany hadn't invaded Poland, there would have been no reason for the Soviet Union to invade Poland as well. They would have had no direct connection. They wouldn't have been able to trade. So as a result, Germany would have been starved of oil in 1940. Now, yeah, okay, maybe they could have won in France in 1939, maybe hypothetically, and then turned against Poland. But one of the reasons stated for why Hitler went to war was because we need to trade with the Soviet Union, we need the oil, etc. Of course, it's not just Hitler going east because he wants to trade, he actually wants to conquer the lands of the east. This is the Lebensraum idea, and he makes this very clear in Mein Kampf. This is just one quote of many where he says, we put an end to the perpetual Germanic march towards the south and west of Europe, which is what the pre-World War I Germany was trying to do, and turn our eyes towards the lands of the east. He wants to conquer the east, and that is why he's going to war. So he's going east because he wants to conquer the lands of the east. He's not going west. He says this in Mein Kampf. And it's not like he declares war on France and takes on France. No, he declares war on Poland because he's going east. So he's not really interested in the west and is only forced to react to that because Britain and France declare war on Germany. So, and that's because Hitler declared war on Poland. But yeah, he's going east. He's not interested in going west. He only has to go west because the war is declared upon him as a result of him invading Poland. So I don't think really they would have gone for France straight away. And I think, you know, in certain games, let's say you do go to France early. No, that's not really economically viable, I don't think, at this time. And it doesn't make sense anyway because, I mean, the whole point of Germany going to the war at this point was to, you know, if they'd have gone, like, how would it have happened? I know, we want Danzig, so therefore we're going to attack France. Like, it would, like, what? Like, how would that have even started? It doesn't make any sense. But, yeah, and East Prussia was disconnected from the right, so they would have had to take that. And yeah, you say about limited operation, but I don't think that would have happened. They would have had to take on Poland and knock it out. And so, yeah, these games like Hearts of Iron, which you can go west first, it doesn't make any sense. But yeah, would the High Command have had the confidence to create the Case Yellow plan without having the testbed of Case White? They probably wouldn't have done it. Well, I don't know. There's no way to know because this is alternate history. But I don't think it's viable for them going west anyway. Why would Britain and France only declare war because Germany invaded Poland? If Germany hadn't invaded Poland, why would they have declared war? It doesn't make any sense. And at this point, I'm going to recommend a video titled Sir Oswald Mosley, an interview on television in 1975. It's linked in the description. The first 5 minutes of this video are really interesting because Mosley, who is a fascist in Britain, said that he was opposed to World War II and opposed to the declaration of war that Britain gave against Hitler because, as Mosley says in the interview, he knew that Hitler was going east, not west, east, and so he said, well, it's not really our war, we shouldn't really get involved in it, let the Russians and the Germans fight amongst themselves with the Poles, and just ignore it. That's what Mosley was saying, and he said that's why he was against the war. Now, whether you believe that fully, that's up to you, but he said that, well, he goes into how the Jews were a problem in Britain and so on, and it's actually a very interesting interview because it gives it from Mosley's perspective. But the point is that, you know, Britain had this option. They didn't have to necessarily go to war. They chose to go to war because of Poland. Mosley says that was silly. They shouldn't have done it, and they weren't even able to protect the Poles, never did. And he says this in the interview. He's like, it was a stupid move, and it's a very interesting video. It's 28 minutes long. The first 5 minutes is really interesting, but the rest of it is interesting as well because As I've said previously, you know, National Socialism and fascism are two different ideologies, and you get to see that in this interview. Mosley says he is a fascist and he's not a National Socialist. And it actually comes across, in my opinion, it actually comes across as though Mosley does not fully understand or does not fully grasp what the difference is between fascism and exactly what National Socialism is. I think he understands there's a difference. He doesn't quite grasp what National Socialism is, in my opinion. So that's interesting. And just to make it very clear, Mosley is a racist fascist, but not a National Socialist. And that's, you know, it's interesting because you can be a racist fascist, but that does not make you a National Socialist. So I'm going to link to the video in the description. Very interesting video, and I'd recommend it. And also then it's like, okay, would the Soviet Union have allied with Poland to help? Because Stalin wants buffer states, you know, we see this after the war. Maybe he could have allied with Poland or helped Poland out, although the Polish didn't want his help. That's part of the reason why they got invaded. Maybe if Germany got bogged down in the West, maybe Stalin would have got involved. I don't think so, though. He wasn't really prepared for war. But it certainly wouldn't, I mean, it wouldn't have helped the situation if Germany and the Soviet Union weren't allied. I think Germany alternative, I'm not good when it comes to alternative history. I'm really not. How would Britain and the USA react to such an early invasion of France? Or Britain, I mean, Britain would have been on the side because they couldn't allow... The whole point of Britain going to war in the First World War was to prevent Germany from dominating the European continent, because Britain's strategy was, if we keep the European powers weak, then that's going to prevent an invasion of the British Isles. So they don't want a strong France, which is why they went against Napoleon. They don't want a strong Spain. They don't want a strong Italy or Germany especially, because any of these strong powers, if they had dominated the whole of Europe, it would have been easier for them to strike against Britain. So they don't want that, so they want to try and keep them weak. So if Germany's invading France, Britain has probably got a good incentive to help France out or help Belgium out, etc., to prevent one power from dominating Europe. So if the invasion of France had happened straight away, I think Britain would have gone on their side. Plus, as we saw historically, they didn't go through the Maginot Line, they went around France's northern borders, and so Britain would have helped Belgium out anyway. The USA probably wouldn't have reacted, because again, they didn't react in the first place to Poland and then France, so why would they react? But yeah, I don't know. I don't know about the high command, but yeah, I don't think this was even possible in the first place. I don't think. And the final question, Jim Land has said, one common thread about World War II on virtually all fronts is the total war element, where civilians were not spared and enemy POWs were treated savagely. For the Japanese, all fronts were that way, and the German-Soviet front was that way. The German Western Allied fronts seem to stick out as being oddly gentlemanly, especially if you compare it to all of the others. Why do you think that is? Okay, yeah, so if you compare the Eastern Front, the Axis Soviet Front, to the Western Front, yeah, there's a lot more deaths going on in the East. So, but, I mean, it wasn't entirely peaceful and gentlemanly in the West. It seems to be in North Africa to most extent. But especially late war, once you get into Normandy, etc., there are atrocities happening in France and so on. So yeah, but as I say, on the scale of things compared to the East, it's certainly not. Especially to the Far East, where prisoners, especially for the Japanese, British prisoners of war, American prisoners of war, being starved to death, and then the Chinese are getting, brutally suppressed. Yeah, it's not good. Why is this? Well, I think it comes down to racism. So, transporting ourselves back to the early 20th century, you've got the idea that the white man, let's say, is better than everybody else. Okay, this is part of the reason why Hitler went to war in the first place. So, and interestingly, the Japanese, I've not read a lot on the Japanese, but they seem to think themselves superior to everyone else in the East. And so we can see that why they treated the Chinese civilians so badly. But the Japanese, once they take on Singapore, the fall of Singapore and so on is like seen as a big example of, hey, the white man can be defeated by the Asians, right? And it's like, oh, the white man's not as good as, you know, he made himself out to be. So, but I've not read a lot on that, so I can't say. But in the West, especially, obviously we know about Germany, they're racist at anything, but the Western allies, the Americans and the British, they have these old imperialist, in the case of Britain, and in Americans, it's like just racist views that there are different people of different origins, different skin colours, etc., and these people are different somehow, and there's like a tier. I remember when I was in university that I saw there was a book published at this time, I forget the book, there's probably a few, where it was like, the white guy is the Western, you know, the savior of Western civilization or whatever, and is like amazing civilized. And then the Japanese and Chinese are seen as sort of middle of the road, and then you've got, you know, black people who are like savages and whatever else. And this was actually, at the time, this is what they thought. You know, it's ridiculous today. It's like, that doesn't make any sense, right? But at the time, given the fact that the West was ahead of everywhere else, mainly due to the economic situation in the 1800s, capitalism, they dominated the world because feudalism and old ideas of tribalism don't, you know, not as efficient as giant factories, for example. So yeah, it kind of if you transport yourself back into that world, it makes sense. And there's people these days who, you know, remember their grandparents or their great grandparents, and it's like how racist they were. And it wasn't like, oh, it wasn't like Hitler's racism where it's like we want to murder everybody or rid people or make the entire nation one nation under one race. You know, that's what National Socialism was. In those days, it was just passive racism, which today people would obviously not be happy with. But back then it was like, yeah, it's just part and parcel of everyday life. So that's part of it. But I think the reason why is because, you know, if you think about Germany and then France and Britain and America, these are all predominantly at this time, you know, their armies especially are full of white men, people with white skin. It's probably better to say, because races don't exist, but, you know, white skinned people. So it's like, oh, well, that's, you know, they're just like us, right? So we'll treat them better than we will the Asiatics. In the case of when Germans went east, that's what they referred to them as, Bolshevik, Judeo-Bolshevik, Asiatic hordes, right? That's what they refer to them as. So if you see these people as not you, if you see these people as, in the case of the Germans, these people are inhuman and savages, and you know, just look at what the Germans say about the Jews. It's you know, it's quite dehumanizing. If you don't see these people as humans, then why would you treat the POWs good? Why would you treat the civilians good? Why would you tolerate anything, right? So that's the reason why. Well, certainly for Germany, again, I've not read too much on Japan, so I can't really say too much about that. But I get the general, same sort of thing. The Japanese think they're superior, certainly to the Chinese. Not sure about the Western POWs. Not sure what they thought about that. If anyone knows, let me know. But that's the reason why. It is all to do with racism. And thinking about today, you know, we kind of look back and go, yes, the National Socialists were racist. And yeah, duh. Okay, we can agree with that. But what we can also say is that, well, actually, the West was racist as well. It wasn't like we're going to put everybody into concentration camps and da-da-da. We're not going to do that. But, you know, with the American army, you do have black people in with the logistics chains with the, what was it called, the Red Bull, was it the Red Bull Express across France? Yeah, you know, that was mainly black people driving the trucks, right? But they wouldn't let them on the front line as much, and there was a whole thing about that, and it's like, what? Why? You know, obviously, we looking back on it would be like, that's stupid. You know, there's no difference between a black person and a white person except for the colour of the skin. What's the difference? You know, what's the point? So, you know, just let them go in the army. But back then, it was like, oh no, we can't. You know, it's kind of like the women thing. Oh, women shouldn't go on the front lines, which is still an issue today. But the Soviets, to some extent, not as much as they made out to be, the Soviets will let their women go on the front line, and I'm not sure what the Chinese, I think the Chinese did as well. No, don't quote me on that. So, you know, there's a whole, it's basically the same sort of thing, but it all goes back to this sort of, if you transport yourself back into the day, you know, everybody was kind of, in some way, I say everybody, most people back in the day were kind of racist as it is. It was only really the Holocaust and World War II as a general, and the assessment of that post-war, that people started to go, wait a second, this might not be right. And then you obviously got the Black Civil Rights movement going on in America, which I partly studied in university. Yeah, that's certainly, that in my opinion would be the reason why. You could also argue, I mean, the Germans said at the time, yeah, the Soviets didn't sign the Geneva Convention, but I mentioned that in the Soviet POWs thing. So I wouldn't really, I said in that, well, they didn't sign it, but the Soviets said, well, we'll keep to it if the Germans agree, and then Hitler was like, no. So, you know, you can't even use that excuse. It was just, I think it boils down to racism, which kind of makes sense if you think of National Socialism, and probably makes sense with Imperial Japan, but I've not read enough on that. So, yeah. I hope this is okay, and I hope this hasn't offended anybody. Because we live in an age where everything gets offensive. Which is just, no. Anyway, moving swiftly on. Thank you very much for watching. I think next week might be the Kurland full series video. It might not be, though. So don't quote me on that, but I'm going to try and get it done this week. So, hopefully. But yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.